Now, there's a fascinating case underway, or situation, I suppose case is slightly premature, going on in New York City. The Wing, which is a woman-only business and networking club, is being investigated by the New York City Commission on Human Rights. This is, I would say, caused some division on the left side of the spectrum between supporters of the Wing and supporters of the Commission and its investigation of the Wing. So here to talk about that case with us now is Katherine Franke. Katherine is a professor of law. In fact, she's a Sulzbacher Professor of Law, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Columbia University. She also directs the Center for Gender and Sexuality Law there, and is a faculty director of the Public Rights Private Conscience Project. And she joins us now. First of all, Professor Franke, thank you for coming on the program.
RJ, it's my pleasure. I will say my name is Franke.
Oh, Franke. Okay. All right. Well, you know, I thought there was a 1 in 10 possibility that was the case, and I bet wrong. I apologize. I should have just asked you beforehand. That aside, you are supporting the New York City Human Rights Commission in this. Let's talk first about the case. Did I correctly summarize the Wing? It's, as my understanding, it's a for-profit entity. It's kind of a networking, like a old-fashioned business club used to be, but for women only. Is that correct?
That's right. It's a membership-only, all-women workspace and networking space. There are 3 sites across the city of New York. You have to apply to be a member, and there's a rather, I gather, rigorous vetting process they put you through. They tend to be rather affluent, largely white, although not entirely, members. And they will admit only people who identify as women. So I think part of the motivation for the creation of the Wing draws from the Me Too movement of wanting to find spaces to work and network where at 5 o'clock the space doesn't turn into a fraternity party, where a keg arrives and work stops, and there becomes, in some cases, a kind of hostile work environment. So there's some real legitimate, and I think good reasons why women might want an all-women space.
Sure.
Unfortunately, it's illegal.
Yeah, that's that's one of the things I wanted to talk to you about was, I have a certain level of ambivalence about this because I am very sympathetic to the idea that women might want a women-only space, not only for the reasons you describe, but to be able to conduct business without, intrusive or objectifying glares or comments. I mean, many reasons I can see. On the other hand, as you say, it's illegal. It's kind of hard to get yourselves around that. And I've also seen a certain targeting of the New York City Commission on Human Rights, which, as far as I'm concerned, is the absolute worst possible way this conversation can go, because isn't it the Commission's duty to look into any situation where somebody might be breaking the law in a discriminatory fashion?
Absolutely. And I think it's worth noting that the Commission hasn't brought charges against the Wing. They haven't prosecuted them. What they've done is just open up an investigation and are looking into the legality of an all-women's club of this nature that does not fall within a very narrow private club exception to the human rights law. And once they opened up this investigation, a fire hose of criticism was launched against the Commission. It's possible that some of that criticism was motivated by the opponents of Mayor de Blasio, and they're using the Wing and the Commission's action here as a way to embarrass the mayor. In New York, everything is political in ways that are complicated, not always foreseeable. But it remains the fact that this kind of business is illegal under the law. I was a lawyer that worked for the Human Rights Commission in the late 1980s when we were litigating cases against private clubs and that didn't admit white people or didn't admit black people. They discriminated on the basis of race. They discriminated on the basis of gender. And we clarified the law at that point that you cannot run a business like this, even for a good reason, and have a criteria of membership, or that choose your customers based on their race or their gender, or sexual orientation, or gender identity, or disability, et cetera.
And I think what adds to my own complex, feelings about this, I mean, first of all, the law does not appear to be complex. You're a law professor. It seems to be very straightforward in this case. But in terms of the ethics of it, I guess I also struggle with the fact that yes, it's an institution for women, but it also appears to be an economically elite institution. For example, I'm looking at the Washingtonian, where an article ran in January, a first look at the Wing, the ultra-chic women's co-working space and social club coming to Georgetown, or something in the New York Times. Or also, and, that use of the word chic reads as sexist to me, but there is also, as opposed, if it were a men's club, I imagine they wouldn't be calling it chic, but there is this notion that it is, what they used to call Tony, or high class, or high income, adding another dimension to this. So, what I see in New York City is a fairly elite institution attacking a human rights commissioner that is herself a woman and gay and Filipina, so that whole aspect of it makes me, I have to confess, very uncomfortable. Am I off base?
Well, I don't want to attribute any bad motivations to the Wing or their lawyers or their advocates for criticizing the commission or the commissioner. I don't know that they've gone after her personally and identified her sexual orientation or race as a reason to single her out. But I would say that we live in a time now where human rights laws are being challenged. The application of human rights laws are being challenged across the country by folks who feel that they shouldn't apply to them because they have a good reason to violate the law. And in so many of those cases, that good reason is a religious or conscience-based reason. And we're seeing an increasing erosion of the authority and the legitimacy of human rights laws or human rights commissions like the New York City Commission through the invocation of religious exemptions. And what I worry is that in this case, I don't think it's witting, but the unwitting turn to a benevolent reason that it's a good thing for women to get together and network with one another, and therefore that the human rights law shouldn't apply. There's a kind of way in which this reinforces the claims made elsewhere that if I have a religious objection to same-sex marriage or to interracial marriage or to employing people of a certain religion, then the human rights law shouldn't apply to me. So I think it's important to see the application of the law in this context in terms of the larger stakes for the authority of non-discrimination rules and the enforcement power of agencies that have to enforce those rules, and how that authority is being undermined across the country. So
you've actually put up a petition, and it's got a number of signatures on this topic, right? Basically in support of what the Human Rights Commission is doing here?
Well, what we wanted to do was, as gender studies academics or advocates, it's not necessarily just stand up for the commission, but say that the commission is a legitimate authority in this case to look into the practices of the Wing, and that we didn't think that it was appropriate that there be a kind of ad hoc carve out, if you will, to the human rights laws, sex discrimination prohibitions, simply because this group of women feel like they have a good reason for doing so. I think it undermines the authority of the commission more generally, and the others who co-wrote the petition with me agreed that this is not an appropriate way to run a business.
So I guess for those who understand, in your petition, the petition you co-authored says, we appreciate the need for groups that experience discrimination to find ways to combat the effects of that discrimination and to provide mutual support to one another. So for those of us who emphatically agree with that statement, can you talk us through some models that might be able to accomplish that goal without running afoul of the law?
Well, there are all sorts of ways in which we support one another through networking. through informal gatherings of mentoring, of the work that we do in our own work environments to make sure that non-discrimination or equal opportunity principles are adhered to. But the one thing you can't do is start a business and have a criteria of that business be discrimination against a wide group of people in the society. So it's important to note that not only does the business discriminate against men, which it does, but also against gender nonconforming people or people who do not identify as women. And New York City's human rights law prohibits discrimination not only on the basis of sex, but also on the basis of gender identity. And so there's actually quite a few people who have a stake in this kind of in the discrimination being conducted by this business. But again, that doesn't mean that we can't engage in all sorts of other manner of support for one another. It just can't be a business model.
And just to be clear, Professor Franke, that means that someone who identifies as non-binary, for example, would be excluded from this club. So really, the purpose of the petition is not, if I understand it correctly, is not per se to criticize the wing, but just to say that its business model is discriminatory and illegal, which is a form of criticism, of course, and therefore there must be other avenues for providing mutual support, and that the position it is taking almost certainly unintentionally reinforces other forms of discrimination that I think most of its supporters in this case would probably oppose as well. Is that a fair?
That's absolutely right. And I think I think we agree with the sentiment that lies behind it. Is that often we need to congregate with other people like ourselves to create safe spaces or to create spaces where we can support one another. But you just can't create a for-profit business that is modeled around that as its central principle. It's just one of the other things we mentioned in the petition that I think is worthy of note is that the turn to private clubs and the domain of the private more generally, whether it's private schools, enclaves, private gated communities, for instance, have always been the refuge of those who wanted to avoid compliance with civil rights laws or advances in civil rights laws. So in the 50s and 60s, segregationists wanted to avoid the racial integration of public schools and did so by setting up private schools. So too with gated communities around the country. They had their own private rules about who they could admit and who they wouldn't in order to avoid the racial integration or having neighbors that they didn't like. And so too with private clubs. They've been an enclave for discrimination in most cases. And so while this might be, some might feel that there are good reasons to have an all-women or all upper-class women's club in this context, to the creation or the legitimation of that impulse in this context will embolden those who feel like, well, then we can have an all-white club or we can have an all-male club if you can too. And that's what worries us.
And I'm old enough to remember when my father was not permitted to join certain clubs because he was Jewish. So, I mean, the breadth and depth of this kind of discrimination has a long history in this country. Final question, Professor Franke, if you will. There are obviously contexts where this sort of gender separation is legal, sororities, fraternities, and so on, but those are not, is the distinction that those are not for-profit businesses and they're smaller than a certain size, or what precisely is the distinction there?
They tend not to be regulated as public accommodations. That's the term of art we use in non-discrimination laws, which means that you are there to serve the public. And it's typically businesses or what public accommodations apply to. And then some laws that regulate discrimination in the educational setting have kind of grandfathered in, if you will, single-sex schools, whether it's Spelman or Barnard, for that matter, and have recognized a kind of historical legacy of schools that were organized around a particular race, but discriminated against race, to be sure, or all women's colleges. But I think even the legitimacy of those institutions is now being questioned. But for now, they're not illegal.
All right. Well, this has been a fascinating topic, and it's a case we're going to be following. I'm not Not sure what happens from here, except that I assume the Human Rights Commission continues its investigation. So Professor Franke, again, Katherine Franke, Professor of Law, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Columbia University. Thanks for coming on the program and talking about that with us.
RJ, it's my great pleasure. Thanks so much for inviting me.